Welcome everyone to the third of our Manchester Turing project series. So if you don't know me, I'm Magnus Rattray and I'm Director of the Institute for Data Science and AI at Manchester. And I'm also the lead for Manchester's relationship with the Turing Institute. So Manchester joined the Turing Institute almost 3 years ago now, I think. And as part of joining the Turing Institute, we had some Turing Fellows, and those fellows had projects. And in this session of 4 retrospectives, we're hearing from our fellows with Turing projects to hear about what they've done and how that project money was used. And it's a quite diverse bunch today. So we've got Dave Topping from Environmental Sciences, we've got Darren Price from Physics, and Caroline Jay from Computer Science. So lots of different stuff. And I think first up is Dave Topping. Oh, before Dave starts, I should say the talks are going to be about 20 to 25 minutes, and then there'll be 5 to 10 minutes questions after each one. If you want to ask a question, you can put it in the chat, and I can ask it, or I can ask you to ask it. Or there's not such a huge audience, you can probably just turn on your mic and talk as well. Without further ado, let's hear from Dave Topping. And Dave's got a great title here. There's something in the air, exploring methods for better understanding the source of airborne particulate matter. Brilliant.
Great. Thank you, Magnus. Yeah, it's kind of like a terrible song title in some ways, isn't it? Let me just pull up the relevant window. So hopefully you can all see the slides now. I can just see.
That works.
Great, cool. Okay, thanks everyone. Yes, thanks for attending. Hope you're all well. It's kind of the talk is a very brief window into a range of activities centered on better understanding the source of airborne particulate matter. I'm also the type of person that will always sneak in a slight modification to a title after I've had it approved as well. So I've also mentioned impact there because I think it better contextualizes some of the work that we have. It's a very diverse area of research and cross-council in nature. And the good thing about some of the Turing activities really is it's starting to provide a bridge for those truly cross-UKRI activities, which is really nice. So hopefully some of the work I'll present here will give some evidence of that. Lots of people involved, 2 people in particular for some of the work presented here, Ian Crawford and Tom Bannon. Not here today. Ian is normally grappling with an instrument on an aircraft, and Tom's normally grappling with the council and their street furniture to implement air quality networks. Okay, so structure of the talk is I'll give a quick background as to why does the work exist, and this touches on some of the core facilities that generate the data that we're working with. The second part, the really proof of concept work that the Turing-funded was looking at better classifying, in particular, biological aerosols, but it forms part of a wider focus on general particulate matter. And this took place early last year, so putting my excuses in already. A lot of the work does rely on access to labs that we've not had, but nonetheless, there's some exciting output, which I'll show you here. Thirdly, I'd like to talk about, the delivering the data for community engagement. We focus heavily on using the data in a more intelligent way from a research perspective, but a lot of this will be driven by community engagement at a policy level as well. And then I'll end on some of the future directions. Okay, so a bit of a background. I'm sure you're all familiar with air quality being a global problem, and it has regional challenges, both in the physical and chemical makeup of pollution, but also the policies that we need to implement to bring about change. In recent years, there's been growing attention to air quality and the levels that cohorts of the population are subject to. And when I talk about air quality, we're talking about it's being dictated by gaseous and particulate components in the atmosphere. And the composition of the atmosphere is driven by both natural and human-generated emissions. Particulate matter is a key component of the air we breathe, and you may have come across the metric PM2.5, which measures the total mass of particulate matter smaller than 2.5 microns. And that's a useful cutoff point from the perspective of particulates getting into our lungs. And it's useful, of course, for various epidemiological studies. One second, you can still see my screen, right? But research is now pointing to a significant differential impacts from what is in PM2.5. And this changes according to the source and the conditions of the atmosphere. What I've got on this slide is just an example percentage contribution to PM2.5, giving a broad overview of the different sector contributions. And whilst total concentrations will vary globally, there's clearly a change. There's clearly a dependency on the local environment and the conditions. But the point that the same PM2.5 levels from transport or industry will have a different health impact from the same level from waves breaking on the coast, for example. So we need to know what's in PM2.5 so we can also investigate the impact of interventions and personal choices. So the data provides us with a changing fingerprint of PM2.5, and the figures I put on the pictures I put on these slides show a range of different contributions. The bottom right showing obviously the increasing trend that is wood burners at homes, which is becoming a growing problem in the UK, and that contributes to PM2.5 levels as well. The global pandemic has given us an unfortunate insight into PM2.5 response to drastic changes in our behaviour. You'll have seen media reports where during the first series of lockdowns globally, a reduction in PM driven by the reduction in industrial capacity led to, for example, the Himalayas being clearly visible for the first time in living memory from the North Indian plains. And such substantial improvements were not seen across Europe, possibly because of the different mitigation strategies to curb the spread of the virus, but also the result of the very different air pollution environments. And in fact, interrogating PM2.5 from Manchester showed that there was no change from a 5-year average during the first lockdown. But what we can do is we can use new technologies to have it and perform a deeper dive on the data collected from our relatively new air quality supersite to tell us what is in PM2.5 and the conditions that lead to change. And there's a lot of text here, I apologise, but I pulled out 4 points, which are kind of generated by expert interpreted data products coming from these instruments, but it's actually really interesting to see. First point is that in terms of black carbon or soot, which actually can contribute a small fraction to PM2.5, but actually leads to a rather large determining factor in terms of health response. No notable change through total levels, but through the instrument response function, there was a clear drop from traffic contributions to black carbon, with an interesting increase from wood burning signatures, particularly in the evening, which also coincided with the collapse of the boundary layer. I don't know if you recall, for those of you around Manchester at the time, there was a problem with councils not picking up green waste anymore, and people were starting burning garden waste in their back gardens. So there's lots of very interconnected effects that we need to study here. We also saw change in the ratio of metals in particulates, where zinc levels increased during periods of easterly and southerly winds, which are a signature of wood burning, but copper also increased during periods of stagnant air when the local influence of traffic remained. And there was also a moorland fire, which caused levels to visibly increase in the city centre under northeasterly flows. And also persistent levels of ammonium nitrate and ammonium sulfate, which are age particles, and were again found during easterly winds, pointing to a contribution from probably agricultural sources. Okay, so knowing what's in the particles is really important for understanding where these things are coming from. But a lot of this work is, like I said before, expert-led. We need to move towards exploiting more data products that we get from a range of different facilities, which I'll talk about shortly. And also, I've put in the bottom of this slide, we also, during this study, looked at using time series forecasting techniques to give us an idea of what's the business as usual levels expected during the lockdown conditions combined with a regional model. And there's still lots of work here. Basically, the red line is the measured NO2, nitrogen dioxide at Piccadilly. The green is that predicted using a simple time series technique, the profit model developed by the Facebook team. Take-home messages: when you include traffic as an additional regressor, you can capture the trend, but there's lots of devil in the detail here. And where there were spikes during early April, it did not capture it according to the Met conditions we weren't feeding into the model. So there's lots of things we can do with the data that's available, but where do we get the data from? Well, there's existing infrastructure that provides data on a range of scales and with a range of information on what pollution is. On the left-hand side, there's the AURN network, and this is a network of stations placed in a range of rural to roadside locations across the UK. The data is openly accessible. In the middle, but that gives you total PM 2.5. It doesn't tell you what's in there largely. In the middle, we have facilities that the Natural Environment Research Council have invested a lot of money in. And they're designed to give us those detailed fingerprints of particulate matter with instruments based on ground-based platforms or on airborne platforms. So they typically respond to a range of different projects, either in the UK or globally. And as I've said a few times, this data requires often manual expert interpretation to classify particulate types, and there's a range of technologies deployed here. EPSRC contributions on the right-hand side include, for example, the urban observatories. And we are one of the urban observatories, a network of 6 universities in the UK. And that really adds to this piece in the sense that it brings in, for example, the facilities around networks of sensors, low-cost sensors, monitoring traffic, footfall, so on and so forth. So it really provides this wider picture for us. But how do we take some of this data forward, and how do we better exploit some of these fingerprints I keep referring to that come from a range of different instrumentations? So for the second part of the talk, I will focus on work we did during a Turing project that was funded last year for moving from detection of biological particulates through to delivering that information in near real time. So what are bioaerosols? Well, they're actually often neglected in the broader narrative of PM in the atmosphere. For those of you with hay fever, I'm sure you disagree. But nonetheless, detecting bioaerosols is important not only for immediate health effects, but also for quantifying the impacts of, for example, urban greening. We know that planting male trees in urban environments looks great, and it gives us a sense of well-being, but also can lead to increase in pollen levels. And as we spend more time indoors, how does exposure to mold impact on our health? So what we've got listed on this slide is a range of different bioaerosols. We have pollens, fungal spores, and bacteria that the instruments I'm talking about here, or will talk about, focus on detecting. We don't go down to the level of detecting individual viruses. You would have heard by now, I'm pretty sure. The scale gives you an idea of the type of aerosol particles, particulate matter, that's in the atmosphere and the size ranges they have. So you can see that pollens typically are larger than 2.5 microns. They go up to anywhere up to 100 microns. Traditionally, how we monitor pollen is through manual techniques, and it provides typically daily counts where someone will actually count pollen grains on a tape that's collected by a drum, and that's reported over a few sparse locations in the UK. Online detection technologies have been developed that exploit the fact that in bioaerosols there's various fluorophores, and they have particular morphological aspects, so size and shapes. And what these instruments do then, they actually measure the ultraviolet induced fluorescent response. So they give us this spectral fingerprint, which we then need to convert into different particulate types. And the more recent instruments combine that with either a scattering image, or in this instance, for this instrument, a holographic image of the particles. So what we did then was work with the instrument manufacturer, Swissems, and the instrument Polano, to move through, which is essentially a classification problem, to then deliver the UK's first, believe it or not, real-time pollen detection facility, which is now delivering data through our open portal and Manchester Eye. And this slide is very briefly capturing that workflow. It's a two-stage classification procedure. Because pollens, intact pollens, have a particularly smooth convex shape, you can first use that as the first filter to discriminate between pollens and other particles. And then an architecture based on VGC16 then used laboratory experiments on known pollen types to then build a classifier on board. And then the development of an API connects that instrument, which is running constantly at the moment at the FIRS site, which is in Fallowfield, to deliver that. So we're really happy with that. I mean, that's as a UK first, we were quite chuffed about that, and hopefully that can be scaled. But of course, not everyone has access to these instruments, which are not very cheap. So how do we take this work forward? And I would say very happy. I haven't provided much details here, but happy to talk about that if people have any questions. Well, we were due, and we are now due, to go to the laboratories in Porton Down to look at a range of bioaerosol types. The previous slide classifies pollens according to their morphological features, but does not exploit the fluorescence data. And as I said before, we're also interested in fungal spores and bacteria. So we're looking at a range of techniques to now actually move this classification capability to detecting those specific types of particles. But this is part of a wider piece. I mean, a lot of the similar technologies do not have as much information as the Polano, but they're cheaper. So really what we're looking to is, can we move to solutions that tell us how much information we need for a fairly robust classification? But also, can we explore other data products from instruments that are looking at, for example, organic aerosol particles, so non-biological particles? And typically when you run these instruments in a field campaign, you're left with hundreds of gigabytes of data. And it's very hard to study in the lab to know what to look for in the first place. The classification of all potential components in non-biological particles is probably still less than 50–60%. Okay, so we still need to know, what are we seeing that we've not detected before? Okay, so we're profiling a range of techniques that have existed for a while, and I've listed two here: deep embedded clustering and learning embedding space for clustering, to really apply those techniques to ambient data sets, and then again use this expert interpretation to see, you know, what specific clusters are appearing under different ambient conditions, and then use that to inform, right, we need to go back to the lab now to actually try and make specific classification of those types. So it's ongoing work for sure. Quickly move on to the data and community engagement side of this piece, and it's great to spend time improving, you know, the classification of specific particles through a range of different instruments. But of course, that information has to be used at some stage, and there's been a boom in delivering data through various open platforms to communities. But really, there's a conversation that needs to be had about what the data actually means and how much you trust it. And I've actually put a controversial question at the bottom right-hand corner of this slide: is open data enough? When it comes to air quality, there can be huge tensions between public communities and interventions that are planned primarily because it affects traffic. And this can be a really pitched battle where communities do not really see the value of road closures and other things. And there was an instance actually during the Urban Observatory project where a single data stream was released prior to a low traffic neighborhood scheme being implemented. Community groups searching for open data to try and judge for themselves the impact of that intervention. And because of the lack of provenance in that center, but basically there was no calibration standards and the stream was taken offline, that was seen as being something that was done on purpose to kind of hide the rationale behind this. So really, this brings to the fore, you know, who do we include in these conversations? How do we make sure that there's trust embedded in everything we do in rolling out new data products, engaging with communities? So what we've started to do from the very start, really, through the Manchester Eye, is try and make that community engagement part of the piece, and make sure what I've called the slow and boring work, which is calibration protocols, validation of sensors, is part of the community story. And everything that we deliver has a certain level of provenance, so that we're benefiting from ongoing projects that are testing the validity of these low-cost sensor solutions, and then delivering data from sensors that we trust accordingly. And I think this has an ongoing importance when we start talking about digital twins as well. And I would encourage you all to read a recent piece that we did with our policy group at Manchester that I think is relevant to the conversations taking place across the Turing community when we start talking about digital twins of urban air and other things, because I think there's huge amounts of positive momentum that we can generate here, but we also need to be careful about what's the longer term goals here and what's the longer term trust that we generate as we roll these things out. And I will just end on a project that we're involved with that ties into all of the above, really. And this came about through the Turing hosted Environmental Intelligence Workshop, where with collaborators in Exeter, we now have a Met Office funded project with the aim of building a new agent-based exposure model, initially focused on Greater Manchester, but we've scaled across the UK. And this is using outputs from the Spencer model, which I think is developed under the Urban Analytics Programme. And we're feeding in this network of measured data, but also information on traffic and other products, with the idea being that we will have estimates of personal exposure for different cohorts of the population in Greater Manchester. So that's really connecting the dots. The Turing, this is an example of where the Turing works, really connecting those facilities I've talked about very quickly. And hopefully we can scale that to other cities. If anyone has any questions about that particular modeling framework, I would encourage you to get in touch with Gavin and Karen accordingly, but I'm happy to take any questions on that. Where next? It's ongoing work, really. I'm very keen to speak to other people who are doing similar work on classification with variable data products. The data is available as well. I mean, in terms of methodological challenges, very happy to share different data products. And really, the next step is bridging technologies and platforms for integrating this with health and well-being data. And I'll provide a link to Caroline's talk there. I'll just exploit my chair at the moment and ask people to, you know, if you're interested in ongoing discussions around the broader environmental piece, do join the interest group at the Turing. We have some great seminars, and there's over 400 registered people now in the group. It's a very active community, and there's a Slack group as well, so we can carry on talking about all these issues there. And I'll stop presenting. I have no idea if I'm on time or not.
Thanks, Dave. Yes, roughly on time.
Great.
Thank Dave. With I think we have this clapping symbol here somewhere. It's not working, but yeah. Okay, thanks very much, Dave. So if there's any questions, you can either just turn on your mic and ask in the traditional manner, or you can put it in the chat. While you warm up, I've got a question actually. So this classification that you were doing with this kind of, it's like a supervised variational autoencoder, isn't it? That,
yeah.
I seem to remember.
Yeah.
So how many do you get in each batch? So how many particles are there in each kind of, do you have a sample which contains lots of particles, and then you have multiple samples, or how does it work?
So the experimental facility, yeah, that's right. So the picture that I showed from the Port and Down labs, it's effectively like a batch reactor. It's a huge stainless steel tube where we just generate as much as we can. Typically, you'll get about only a couple of thousand per sample. It costs about, so we'd like to collect fresh pollens But to generate things like bacteria, fungal spores, you're kind of restricted to what samples you can work with.
Sorry, can I just ask you that? It's very similar to single cell data that we have, where you have a sample and then you have multiple samples, and each sample has, like in our case, tens of thousands of cells or hundreds of thousands of cells, but you've got thousands of these.
Yeah.
You get like, technically, are there batch effects between the samples, and do you do any correction for that? Like if you put them all into that autoencoder, do you find a batch effect in the clustering as well?
No, not yet. I mean, what we apply kind of standard augmentation techniques to the classifiers. The thing that we're more worried about at the moment, to be honest, is we still don't know how the response changes between a very fresh sample of, say, pollen and a pollen that's been dried out. Because when you buy pollens, they're dried, they're desiccated. And we know that in the atmosphere, under high humidity environments, we see pollen fragments because you get an osmotic pressure that bursts them. So we're more, I think at the moment, the challenge for us is still to get a consistent kind of a consistent sample, really, and then make sure that we use the appropriate augmentation techniques to kind of build as much of a robustness in the classifier as possible. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, it's just because we see big batch effects in that type of approach. So we have to do batch correction between each of the samples.
I see.
But it's quite difficult because the number in each class is different in every sample because the samples are different. So you can't do naive batch correction. You've got to rebalance the classes, and it's
yeah, for pollens at least, you probably get a between 20-30% variation in number between batches.
Not huge. No.
No.
We have entirely missing cell types and things like that. So
well, yeah, I mean, I'd say that on the pollens that we can get our hand on, we are missing pollens that are relevant for the UK, and we're speaking with botanists at the moment to try and get our hands on fresh samples.
So the reason I know about that model is because I'm supervising a PhD student on the Wellcome Trust program with the Turing, and they just submitted a conference paper where they generalized that to multiple views. So you don't just have a class, you have other things as well. So if you're interested in a generalization of that model, I can put you in touch with that person.
Definitely. And I think if there's anyone doing work on kind of the deep embedded clustering techniques, because like I said in the talk, you know, when we're applying these techniques to 200 gigabytes of 6-month data of everything that we collect, I mean, that's the size of data you can't do agglomerative clustering on. You've got to run something that's quick and easy to interpret. So we're trying to move the products to a k-means friendly space. I know we want more powerful techniques, but still nonetheless something that gives us information but also allows us to do rapid analysis. That's
Sorry, I've humped the questions.
Sorry. Yeah.
Is anybody got another question from Dave other than me? No, everyone's. It was obviously completely clear.
Or completely vague.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that. And next up is Darren Price from physics. And Darren is going to talk about developing machine learning enabled tools for experimental design, statistical modeling, and scientific discovery in the physical sciences. So sounds like a really great overview. So over to you, Darren.
Hi, hopefully you can hear me and see my slides.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, good. Right, yes, so I sort of also edited the talk title a little bit to trim it down for the purposes of this, but yes, great to be able to speak to you today about the work we've been doing with the Turing. Really on sort of embedded in the context of particle physics challenges. I'll talk about a little bit in a second, but you know, really trying to be conscious such that the tools and the methodology that we've been working on in this project could be applied quite straightforwardly to other similar challenges in other areas of physical sciences, perhaps beyond. So I'll start by just flashing up people involved in the project and external collaborators. Key person here is Dr. Stephen Menery, who's the Turing-funded postdoc on the project. Also through the Science and Technology Facilities Council provides some partial matched funding for this at later stages. Really, without him, this really wouldn't happen at all. I also want to mention, flash up a few names of some other postgraduate and undergraduate students who've worked on elements of what I'll be presenting here, and some spin-off work as well, which I won't have time to discuss, but were sort of part of the ecosystem that was enabled by Turing research. We also work with a variety of external collaborators, pre-existing and also some that have come about from the Turing support. So to give a bit of context again, so the primary aim here is to tackle a particular computing challenge with the use of machine learning in particle physics, driven by the large data volumes, data velocities that we deal with in particle physics, and also the wide space of theory models. A lot of the work we do at the very end of the data collection and interpretation process is really compare our data against simulations of what we expect from theory of what we know about and theories of what we might expect to see. In answers to big questions of what is dark matter, are there anomalies in the known forces, are there new particles that we haven't seen before, and to really interpret our data we need to have those theory models available to drive statistical inference. But there's a huge variety of possible models out there and a very high dimensionality to the theories, so it's a real challenge to basically map these theories onto the data we have seen. So the aim here is to help with that process, and in particular derive machine learning techniques that can really enhance our ability to efficiently simulate physical processes that we see in our particle colliders, that give us the data that we then want to infer information about nature from, maximize our ability and effectiveness to make statistical inference, to maximize the amount of theory models we can compare, and also to optimize our experimental design. If we can have machine learning models that know about physical processes, that know about the theory models we're interested in studying, can we use machine learning to act as a scientific advisor in a way to augment the domain knowledge of a particle physicist or another scientist, and give them a prod in the right direction about information that they may have overlooked. So I want to underline again that the methods were developed here on a test bed of particle physics. We're working with a specific use case that we know and are in control of, but we were quite conscious throughout the design of this entire tool to make sure that it really didn't embed and bake in any knowledge of particle physics into the model or the techniques used. In principle, this could be transported to other fields in the future. So to situate us, what we're the data set we're going to be focusing on today, we're going to be working with the data from the Atlas detector at the Large Hadron Collider. This is shown in this picture at the bottom here. So what happens is protons are accelerated around the Large Hadron Collider close to the speed of light, 27-kilometer collider. They collide at the center of this detector. And then this detector is really made up of a huge range of microelectronics that see the collision. And in the collision, we reproduce conditions last seen in the Big Bang and can produce particles and interactions and forces. And from measuring the debris from the collision, can infer properties of particles produced and the forces that mediate the interactions between matter. So this is another picture of the particle detector we're talking about. This is made up of order 100 million high precision sensors that have to read out data from particle collisions every 25 nanoseconds. So as you can imagine, this is a huge amount of data to deal with, both in velocity and volume. And there's a lot of machine learning challenges and a lot of activity in going from reading out and dealing with that data to moving from very raw data of electronic signals in various aspects of the detectors through to more meaningful things like reconstructing, identifying known particles, trajectories, and higher level information. And then a lot of feature engineering to sift that data, build higher level observables based on our physical knowledge, and then measure things like the rates of particles produced versus some physical quantities of interest, and compare the data against our predictions from our best known theories, which we describe as the standard model of particle physics. And then what we're looking for is deviations in that data from the standard model, either a bump that might be evidence of some new particle, or some excess in particle production above what we predict from our theories, or some modification to the theory, which might also allude to some modified interaction, some different physics that we previously didn't understand. So as I've mentioned already, a lot of work then goes into the end stage of this, into hypothesis testing. You have to have a very good expectation of what you expect to see in the particle colliders and how the output of the collisions interacts with the detector and what those signatures look like. You also then have to have a good understanding of what alternative models of new particle production, new phenomena might also look like in your detector, so that you can really match what you see against the data and see what's correct. An example of that is shown in the bottom right here. This was one of the first evidences. We had hints of a signal of the Higgs boson. The data points here show some experimental data from very early in the running of the Atlas detector. And you can see in red some known particle processes, and then the three peaks here show some potential models of what at that point was new physics, which was the production of a Higgs boson at various different masses. And you can see the data points are just about favoring the signature shown in blue here. Without these simulations, you really would have quite a hard job inferring that you had seen something from the data, what you should be expecting, and really interpreting what you're seeing. There are some limitations in the sort of approaches that are typically used. There's some information loss. We're going from a huge amount of data, high dimensional space of information read out from the detector, to things like this plot on the bottom right, which is a histogram of some data with some selection criteria, some filtering of the data, and making a one, maybe a couple of variables, distributions of a couple of variables to kind of characterize the data we've seen. So we are losing some information in these procedures. That's also just to deal with the data rates we have to handle. There are also some limitations on our ability to discover the unknown. To some extent, in our choice of data selections to throw away data that we are not interested in, or where we're not expecting to see a signal, and optimizing our data selections to be very efficient at selecting the things we are interested in studying, we are making choices. And so there's the possibility that we're making wrong choices. We could be throwing away data or not analyzing data that does have some discovery potential inside it. And it becomes a very intractable problem to repeat these kind of measurements time and time again for lots of different theory models, looking for all different types of particles, all different types of phenomena. So we try to design the measurements as comprehensively as possible, but of course there's still edge cases where you might miss things, especially unknown unknowns. I should also just talk about the size and complexity of the data sets we're talking about here as well. We are talking about data sets at the sort of exabyte scale, and we are talking about huge CPU consumption, and a lot of the budget for disk and storage goes on data analysis of the raw detector itself. About half of it actually goes on simulations of the standard model and these theories that we're trying to test. So if we can improve the efficiency and our ability to quickly generate simulations, synthetic data of our theory models, that will also hugely lower the computing commitment and requirements of these experiments going forward. So the Turing-supported work uses an autoregressive Gaussian mixture model approach to try and describe these physical processes in simulations. These are both the known processes and any hypothesis processes we're searching for. And the idea is here that this approach can describe probability densities of where these particle processes show up in a very high dimensional space without the need for binning the data explicitly in histograms or applying any restrictive pre-selections. It's very flexible and maximizes the information that's contained. If we can learn from existing simulations what these high dimensional feature space, what this high dimensional feature space looks like for a particular theory, then we can actually use that to sample from to provide us with an alternative method of simulating such processes in future. So it provides us with an alternative way of efficiently simulating across this higher dimensional theory parameter space. It also means that we can potentially use these to do fast inference for us, but to do that we need to be able to understand if these simulations really can characterize the data without any bias. And that's something I'll talk about in a few slides' time. And then if we do have knowledge of known phenomena and we understand how the new theory we want to test, falsify or see the data is consistent with, encoded in these probability densities in the machine learning model, can the machine actually learn physics and help us to optimize our experiments, current and future? So we've picked for the challenge, the test, a particular physical process of interest, the Large Hadron Collider. It's not important really what this is for the purposes of this talk. And we've synthesized data from the Atlas experiment, Large Hadron Collider. So we haven't used the raw data for this purpose. We've just created a synthetic data set that looks exactly like it. And then what we're trying to do is search for anomalies in this type of particle interaction. And we do this in a particular theory framework called the SMEFT, which just very conveniently characterizes any kind of anomalies for us in a set of real valued coefficients. So if all these are 0, it's the standard model. There's no unknown physics in the data set. If these values go off 0 in particular ways, then we're seeing some new phenomena that we haven't seen before, and these numbers give us a way to parameterize and characterize what exactly that new phenomena is. So these probability densities that are set up in the model are dependent on the synthetic data, and they are conditional on parameters of interest, which are the theory model parameters, but also maybe some other hidden variables such as experimental uncertainties. We use this Gaussian mixture model approach. A few difficulties with that are that GMMs typically model smooth turn-offs at boundaries, and the data can actually have very hard cutoffs. This can be limitations on the extent of the detector coverage. You might be able to read particles out to a certain angle and then nothing when there's no detector there. You might have a minimum threshold below which particle energies can't be measured, so that provides a hard cutoff. So a lot of work was put into how we can still use Gaussian mixture models, but deal with this limitation that we have hard cutoffs in the data. Another important requirement of this model is that variations of these theta parameters introduce deformations to the kinematic distributions we actually measure in data, and our model has to be expressive enough to capture that, and that requires a lot of very narrow overlapping Gaussian modes, so that we can really completely characterize any deformations we expect to see in the data. So to deal with these hard physical boundaries, what we do, and this is one example for one physical variable shown on the left-hand side here in red, is we take our physical observable, this is the probability density versus some kinematic variable, in this case it's an angle, and you can see these hard boundaries that exist that are physically motivated, which we want to get rid of. So a lot of work has gone into deriving a projection, which I won't go into the details of here, to project this from the physical space onto a latent space that removes these physical boundaries, hard boundaries, and smooths them out such that this data can be described by a set of narrow Gaussian modes. Important thing to highlight here is there's one tunable parameter in here. This is important that it's so simple yet so expressive, in that this tunable hyperparameter f really allows us to describe any kind of kinematic distribution that we see in the data, or any probability density that we see in any kind of data set at all. And you can tune this this parameter f such that you get a good description of the data with these Gaussian modes, and then you know you can move forward. So it really allows a lot of flexibility in the model. There's really nothing about the model here that's specific to this data set that we're studying. So having implemented that projection from the latent space onto from the physical space onto the latent space, we can see on the right-hand side here how good this network is doing at describing the data. So the data shown by the gray histogram in this case, and you can see the dashed black line showing what the model has learned. It's important to mention that we actually train the model on one particular value of theta, in this case corresponding to the standard model of particle physics, and then we apply a mapping function, the same mapping function between the latent and the data space, to all values of theta, describing all possible new phenomena that are encoded in this theoretical model, so that continuous variations in the observable spectra, things we might measure in data, are transformed into parameterizable deformations of these Gaussian modes in the latent space. So I showed that one example for one distribution, but that is actually a very simple case. We actually measure much more than one piece of information in the real data. So we want to extend this to multiple dimensions, and to do this we use this autoregressive probability density. So the probability densities from before in the latent space is shown here, but the difference is now that we add these in multiple dimensions. So these could be multiple experimental quantities, for example, conditional on all prior latent observables. So we make this construction of the overall probability density as follows, where each of the individual probability densities is given by these narrow Gaussian modes. This is actually a pretty elegant way of doing things, and actually fully captures both the dependence on the external parameters theta, the theory model that we want to know about and test against the data, and on all of the preceding observables. So any observables we want to add, and this is completely extensible. If we have 10 bits of information that we want to test against the data, or 20, really doesn't matter. The model can deal with this. And critically, it knows about high dimensional correlations between all of these observables, both in the data and in the theory models you want to test. So you can really maximize the information that you're extracting from the data. So does it work? Well, the answer is yes. Here's an example where we extended this model to 12 different variables. Doesn't matter what these variables are, but these are really 12 variables that really characterize this process under study. The black shows you the data. The red shows you the output from the density model, the machine learning density model. You can see it's doing an excellent job of describing this data across orders of magnitude for all of the observables. It also captures all the higher dimensional correlations. So these are these same observables in a 2D grid. Obviously on the diagonal, these become completely trivial, but you can see that there are very complex correlations between these different kinematic variables in the data. This is for the synthetic data, and on this next slide is what the density model, the machine learning model, learns. And you can see it's doing a really good job of being able to capture the information content in the data. Crucially, as well as knowing about the data and the kinematic distributions, the model is also able to understand how these data distributions are deformed if a different theory scenario is present. This plot here shows you one particular variable, an angle between two particles that are produced in the particle collision. For a two-dimensional grid of two parameters in the theory model. So the center would be the standard model, so there's no deviation. And then as you go off the center, what you're looking at is how the synthetic data in black and how the machine learned model in red deform the standard model predictions to the alternative model predicted by a theory. So it's really capturing as well, not just the kinematic distributions themselves and the correlations, but also this information about how a modification to the theory, which could be present in data, would modify these spectra. And here's just another example of that on the second slide. So we can put all this together. We have this learned model now which knows about the physical features that are present in the data. It knows about the correlations between all these physical features, and it knows how those physical features get modified arbitrarily when you change the theory. So can we use this to derive insight when presented with the data? The answer, happily, is yes. We actually tested this for 9 different synthetic pseudo data sets. We inject these black points here in theory parameter space, two parameters of this SMEFT theory. We had pseudo data which has some non-standard model, some new phenomena effects in it, and we asked the model to tell us what it finds in the data. And the blue cross and the blue contours showing the confidence levels show you what the results of the data inference were. So you can see it's in all cases managing to tell us from the data what we knew, but this tells us a lot about its ability to infer knowledge when it's given data. So it is really learning. Going further than that, then we can also use this now to design optimal experiments. So we discussed an isolated physical process. In reality, we have multiple processes we need to disentangle from the data. Here we have a learned model which knows a lot of information about that physical process. But if we extend the training to all possible processes that could occur in these particle collisions, could we use this model to help us design optimal experimental measurements instead of requiring the physicist to put on selections on the data, pre-selections on the data to end up with a plot on the right-hand side, to sort of make a cost-benefit judgment between efficiency of reconstructing the signal you're interested in trying to find versus processes that you know all about. Can we use this model to do this? So yes is the answer. We extend this model where we can we can train the machine learning model on one process and another process, or one process and a new phenomena process, and let the model tell us what variables are important to be able to best distinguish the process of interest from all the other processes that exist, and really tell us what is the most optimal measurement we can perform. So these are 4 example distributions here, 4 experimental quantities we can measure in data. And what this top row shows you is that by the scatter, shows you across all the different model variations. A large scatter means that there's a lot of information content, whereas a small scatter means that you can't really use the data in that region to distinguish between the 2 models under test. So broadly speaking, what this is showing us is that low values of this variable don't provide us with any useful information. High values have a lot of discriminating power. Higher values still don't have much discriminating power, and that's mainly because of a lack of data in these really high regions. It also tells us that although this is a potentially discriminating variable, if we cut around this region and exclude this low discriminating data, that'll help us a lot. Measuring this quantity as a histogram, as it's binned on the bottom here, doesn't necessarily give us a lot of discrimination power. It's quite flat in this variable. Although this quantity over here, you can see there's a lot of structure. And this is a ratio between the null and the alternate hypothesis in this case, tells us that this variable will be really, really important to distinguish between one model and another. We can extend this to 2D. I won't go into the details about that now, but it is doing sensible things and reaching conclusions that a real physicist would. And we can go a step further and ask us, instead of just showing us pictures, we can ask it to formally tell us what are the best selection cuts to apply to the data as well. And just flash this up here. I won't go into the details of it in the slide. But it really is able to tell us the best selection criteria to put on the data and how to optimize our experimental analysis and experimental design to test a particular theory. As I say, this particular aspect of the work is in progress, but this is also very generalizable. I'll come to a conclusion then by just highlighting funding. I talked about matched funding that we also received from STFC, the Research Council for Particle Physics, to explore applications of this into particle physics data sets. I would also like to say that the value added by Turing to be able to do this is huge. This kind of research wouldn't have been possible without Turing support, and it has enabled us to do something completely new, and has led to a lot of spin-offs that I haven't been able to discuss today. And yeah, it's opened up a lot of future funding opportunities as well. I'll flash up outputs of the project. I won't go through the details, but just to say that there have been a lot of conference and workshop talks, some publications, one out, one just submitted, and the full code is about to be released as well. And I'll summarize there with saying that the Turing project support has enabled us to develop an effective and efficient machine learning approach for the simulation, statistical inference, and experimental design in particle physics, which I hope will find application in future to other fields. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. We've got a question from Sami Kaski. Maybe, Sami, the best thing is just to ask it in words, verbally.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the great talk. So, yeah, what I missed is that how do you express what the physicist knows to begin with? I mean, that you need in order to distinguish insights from what is already known. So, it's the assumption that the physicist is able to express the model that they have in the beginning, and then you are explaining or exploring with the experimental design whatever deviations there are from that model.
Yeah, so there's possible extensions of this. Of course, we try to keep it relatively tractable, I would say, in this case. But what the input to the model is has some physicist insight already, and I think this is a good example of this on this slide, slide 17. We provide the model with quite high-level features, so we're not providing the model with the low-level information from the particle collisions. What I mean by that is we're not providing it with the electronic signals of that a charged particle has hit this part of a type of detector at this time, and that's far too information dense. It's far too much information to deal with, and it's lower level information than we have encoded here. That's not to say that such things wouldn't be possible in future. It's just enormity of information. So what we are doing is already, to some extent, synthesizing and summarizing a lot of the raw information that comes off these detectors into what we call high-level observables. So these are, instead of these electronic signals, we say, okay, we saw instead of this pattern of electronic signals, we saw this particle with this trajectory and these properties pass through this detector at this time. And that might be, for example, this quantity here is the transverse momentum of some particular type of particle, or it might be the angles between two types of particle of interest. So we are dramatically reducing the amount of information that comes off the detector to what we give the model to, in this case, a dozen or so high-level observables to try to synthesize as best possible that information, with the knowledge that these quantities could or should be of interest to us and to the model, to be able to distinguish the phenomena that we're trying to explore. So we are giving it the distributions, we're giving it this information, essentially. We're giving it the distributions of these kinematic quantities in one dimensions and correlation information with all the other observables as well, and we're telling the model how these deform as you traverse the theory space of all possible parameters.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So maybe those could be elicited in some way as well, but yeah, that's a different research topic. I agree. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so you could broaden this. Yeah, you could to include more information. As I say, there's nothing stopping you from having, instead of having 12 variables, you have in 24, just means more training. And you could go deeper and use lower level information in future, potentially. Yeah.
So, I mean, the density estimation is a sort of, it's a very sort of standard problem in probabilistic modeling. So but you had to come up with something new. So what characterizes your problem that makes it not suitable for existing methods? Is it that you have a vast amount of data so that you can fit richer, so maybe the curse of dimensionality isn't hitting you perhaps as much as might be usually, or why do you need a new method? That's what I'm asking.
It's two things, I think. One is, I think it's summarized really by some of my introductory slides. It's really the amount of data that we're dealing with in the first place. We have to go from these very raw, low-level bits of information to high-level information, first of all. We have to throw away most of it based on decisions we make early on about what's interesting, what is not interesting. And then we have to further shrink that information before it's even tractable for us to deal with. And we have to make decisions at that point based on sort of physics knowledge, physics intuition, the specifics of the model that's under study. So we have to make those decisions just to deal with the huge amounts of data we're talking about. Then on the theory side, although on a case-by-case basis, you're dealing with testing one theory against the data. You want to falsify this theory or see if the data is at least consistent with it. But in reality, you actually have a theoretical framework. Say, for example, you're interested in studying dark matter. There's not one theory of dark matter. There's lots of different types of theories of dark matter. And inside those theories, the mass of dark matter, its interaction properties, what types of other particles there are in that theory are all unknowns. So there's a huge dimensionality to the theory space as well. And it's already an intractable problem to test every single theory, meaning a point in that theory space, against the data. And partially just because of that reason, it's also possible to miss particular theories that perhaps are consistent with the data because they're not well motivated perhaps by prior conceptions. Or you may actually be designing the measurements, see my previous point about throwing away parts of the data, in such a way that you're optimizing for some theoretical models, but non-optimal for others. So you could be designing measurements that aren't seeing anything, that are null results, but it's because they're not optimal, and that doesn't mean that those theories aren't true.
Great, thanks, Darren. Okay, so I think we move on to our final speaker. Let's thank Darren once more. Our final speaker is Professor Caroline Jay from Computer Science, who's going to talk about understanding the relationship between human health and the environment. Over to you, Caroline.
Right, let me see whether I can find the right window.
That's it.
Okay, hopefully that looks about right. Okay, yeah, so this is obviously quite a broad title that I've got here, Understanding the Relationship Between Human Health and the Environment. We've known for many years now that there is, at a sort of population level, a relationship between these two things. But it's actually the advent of mobile and wearable technology has allowed us to look at this in much more detail. So the particular question that we were looking at in this project was, how does the environment that people are living in terms of their environmental surroundings, affect respiratory symptoms, and in particular hay fever and asthma symptoms? So that was kind of our high-level research question. But of course, really, what we were doing in the project, and this is one of the reasons that the Turing funding was extremely useful, is we were looking at how we can develop the way that we do this research. At the moment, there are no established methods for dealing with this kind of research. So there are lots of people working in the area now, so it's a growing sort of area and lots of interesting stuff going on. But from a sort of in terms of experimental design and statistical analysis, actually, a lot of these methods are not particularly well suited for this kind of investigation. And so it's interesting to try to work out how we should sort of map these things together and how we should try to uncover whether there are any real effects. So this started, the data we're using here started in 2016 with an app called Britain Breathing. This was a citizen science project. So the PI is Sheena Cruikshank, who you can see in the middle here at New Scientist Live promoting the app. And this project was really asking people who had primarily had hay fever. It was for use by anyone, so anyone could report their symptoms, but aimed particularly at hay fever sufferers, to record their symptoms on a daily basis, or as frequently as they were able to. And that would give us an understanding, hopefully, of why we were starting to see an increase in incidence in hay fever, which has been happening. It's really been sort of ramping up over the last few years. So many people experience hay fever now, and try to sort of gather some hypotheses about why that might be happening by mapping it to somebody's location and time stamping it, and so we could then pull out data about their surroundings at that point in time. So it was co-created and promoted through lots of avenues, and it's been running ever since, with varying numbers of users each year depending on how much promotion we've been doing. So just to give you an example of what the app would look like, it's very simple to use. So you can see here that it asks you how you're feeling today. So you can say great or so-so or bad. And if you say so-so or bad, then you're asked to rate your symptoms. So it's nose, eyes, breathing and tiredness. So these are between 0 and 3. Tiredness is quite a recent addition, so we don't really have we haven't done a lot of analysis with that yet. But in addition to these variables, we also ask people whether or not they've taken medication that day. We have a timestamp for the data, obviously. We capture someone's location in GPS coordinates, and we collect some basic demographic data like sex and date of birth. So the reason for the Turing project really was initiated by this set of visualizations. So what you can see here is all of the data from 2016 when the app was launched. And these are all the data points for the whole year superimposed onto a map. And this is the wellness data. So on the left-hand side, you can see people who say they're feeling great. And then in the middle, people who are middling, and on the right-hand side, people who say they are feeling bad. And what we noticed just by looking at this visual representation of the data is that in the first two graphs, the data points seem to be reasonably evenly distributed across the country. Whereas if you look at the one on the right, which is where people are suffering from more severe symptoms, they tend to be clustered in urban areas. So we can see a cluster around the southeast and in the northwest and so on, which might be corresponding to more urban areas. So that was kind of the impetus for us. So we thought, OK, if we look at the app data and then we look at what was happening in the environment at that moment in time, in terms of weather, pollen data and air quality data, so data about various pollutants, then we might be able to start to sort of form some idea of what's going on and why people are experiencing more severe symptoms in cities. So just to summarise here, what we've got is the location that someone's in when they're reporting, we've got the time that they're reporting, and we've got their symptoms. So all we have to do is take the value of the weather, the air quality and pollen from this location at this point in time and map it to the symptoms. So that sounds really straightforward. And I mean, inevitably, it is not that straightforward. So environmental data we were using, there were altogether about 35 variables, I think, that we were looking at, and these included some of the data that Dave has mentioned earlier on. So from the Automatic Urban and Rural Network, we were using things like NOx, sulfur dioxide and ozone, NO2, and then PM10 and PM2.5. We're also using data from the University of Exeter, available via their MEMI database. So this is meteorological data, air temperature, pressure, relative humidity, pollen data as well. And we also looked at land use. So this is classifying land, this is from the land use database. There are many categories in this, but we sort of categorised this as either urban or rural, so it was one or the other. So one of the reasons we collected weather data, we looked at weather data as well as air quality data, is because it really mediates what's happening with air quality. So Dave Topping was one of the investigators on the project, along with Douglas Lowe, who they are both atmospheric scientists and experts in this area, and we're looking at this kind of data. And it's clear that it's not a sort of simple relationship between what happens in the air quality in terms of what the monitoring stations are saying and what the weather is saying as well. Now, I'm not going to claim that we sort of unpicked this complexity as part of this project. We did a little bit of work on it, but you can see from this that you've obviously got, so this is NO2, I think we've got here, and you can see it originating from sort of more urban centres, but then certainly in the case of Manchester, you can see it's moving across the Pennines because of wind, and so you've got relatively complex relationships. So this is one area of complexity in the project. So in terms of additional issues with this kind of data, we basically find that there's a lack of data in quite a lot of aspects. So you can see here the pollen monitoring stations. So there are 12 of these, I think, in the UK. And you can see there are hundreds of miles between them. So if you're right next to a monitoring station, you might be getting a reasonably accurate reading. But if you're somewhere in between, you might not. And so this means that it's quite difficult sometimes to kind of infer the readings that you should get between these stations. And in addition to these gaps, which are a major headache, you've also got missing data from the stations as well. So pollen data obviously is only measured for 50% of the year, because as Dave mentioned, it's a manual process a lot of the time. It's hard work, so we don't bother with it over the winter when there's going to be much less pollen in the atmosphere. So we've got 50% of that missing. And in terms of air quality, we have around 5 to 12% missing per pollutant. We have got 1.5 to 5.5% missing per variable in terms of the weather data. And you can see an example of the kinds of reason it's missing. So here we've got PM 2.5 along here, and you can see in 2018 there's just nothing. So this is probably, that sensor was broken, that or needed to be replaced or something like that. So we also need to think about these kinds of issues when we're looking at this. So we did a lot of work on imputing the missing values, and I won't go into the details now of this. Doug Lowe has given an excellent talk on this, and I believe he'll put details of that into the chat for anyone who's interested. And we used a combination of data from surrounding stations and the simulation as well, the EMAP simulation that you saw earlier on, which Doug has run for the UK for the years of the project. To infer basically the missing values where we needed to. One of the things we did to help with testing this is, and this a theme of the project has been providing tools and data to researchers, is build this web app. So what you can see here is again the pollen monitoring stations on the map. And what we've got in the green down here are the actual values from these stations. So what you can do with the app is you have your estimation methods running in the background, and what you can do is take out one of the sensors, run the estimation methods to give you the values that we would expect for that station given our methods, and these are shown here in red. So it gives you a way of kind of doing a sort of visual check on whether or not the data you're getting back is like way off, or actually somewhere in the realms that you might expect. So you can upload your own data sets to this app, and you can also use it to explore some of the default data sets in terms of air quality that we've got in there as well. So I would say that the data cleaning and processing that we had to do for the environmental data probably took about 3/4 of the project, so about 18 months of work. And if you care to look at the GitHub and the data sets and so on we've produced, you'll be able to see why that's the case. So we've got downloading data, so it's great that this data is open and available, but actually, and again, Dave raised these issues earlier, we need to do a lot of checking of the data. So checking for spurious values, we're checking for missing values, we're imputing missing values where it's appropriate to do so. For our purposes, we're calculating the daily mean and max. So some of the data is hourly, some of it you might capture 4 times a day. And so we need to work out what the unit of analysis is. And for us, we decided that a daily mean, because people are reporting once a day, was what we were going to go for. And then, of course, you need to test the extraction methods and the transformation methods and the imputation methods. So we've got the app to do that, and we've got unit tests to do that as well, to make sure that we think our data is robust. And then we need to spend some time just tidying those up and making them all available to people. And the reason we've done that is because this is a really massive, aside from the fact that we all kind of practice reproducible research in the research group, this is a kind of huge area at the moment. I think people really trying to understand air quality, and also it's about opening it up to people who are not experts in the area already. So it takes a really long time to get to know this data. So we've written a scientific data paper about this, which is going through its final set of revisions at the moment, so it isn't released yet, but hopefully will be out shortly. But we have released the data sets, and we've released all of our kind of estimation code and processing code as well. So that can be extended if people want to do slightly different things with the data. And we know that this has been useful to people, because within a week of releasing this, in January earlier this year, we were starting to get downloads, and we've had about 200 downloads to date. So it's positive that the community sort of know about this and are starting to use this data set. Okay, so back to the app. So we had across the 4 years about 6,600 participants and about 53,000 records. But there was a lot of variation, okay, in terms of how the app was used and from year to year and so on. And there were some slight differences in terms of the way data was collected, because we kind of updated the app, and so there are issues there. We think that we have different participants in each year to a large extent. So we kind of promote it each year, and then people seem to use it for a year and drop off. There may be some people who are using different versions of the app, and they may be the same person, but we're not sure because we haven't got the identifier carrying across. The project was developed on a shoestring, so there are lots of technical issues like that we didn't quite resolve. And there's quite a lot of variation between years. So in 2016, we had many thousand downloads, but people were only reporting on average about 6 times. Whereas in later years, we have fewer people using it, but they're more committed. So we've got some average of 18 reports per user for people who are later on. And of course, we've got some users who report hundreds of times, and other people who only report once or twice. And as with most citizen science projects, that is, the number of reports is massively skewed towards the lower end. So this is something that we see very commonly in this kind of project. In terms of thinking about the data itself, there are loads of challenges we try to interpret it. So because we designed the app, you'd think that we would know what to do with the data and how to interpret it, but actually there are lots of things that kind of creep out that you think about after the fact. So, for example, are participants reporting from the place they experience symptoms? Well, we expect them to be, but they might not be. They might be reporting at the end of the day after a 60-mile commute. Can we trust data from participants who only report a handful of times? Again, this is a really live question in citizen science, and it's a bit of an open one. And where you draw that cutoff for, okay, this is an engaged user and this isn't an engaged user is to some extent a bit arbitrary. So this is another thing that we need to do more work on. And finally, and I think this is a really big one for health-related citizen science in particular, is looking at missing values. So we know with the environmental data whether it's missing or not, because it's either there or it isn't. And there is the odd case, right, where there are some values that don't look quite right, or there's a 0 we might expect there not to be. So these things are always going to happen. But most of the time that's not too much of an issue. With this particular project, it is more of an issue because we don't know whether the data is missing or whether it's really 0. And the reason with this question is because over winter, we invite people to continue to report over winter, and most of them don't. We have about 3 people who report over winter. And that's because they're not experiencing symptoms. So we know that people stop reporting when they're not experiencing hay fever symptoms. However, that doesn't necessarily mean we can say during the summer when they're not reporting that they're not experiencing symptoms, because they might have just forgotten. But this, again, gives you a kind of idea of the challenges that there are with this sort of data. So the analysis for this is ongoing. So what I'm going to do is give you a sort of overview of some of the issues that we can see with what we're doing at the moment in terms of how we're treating the data, because the way the experiment's designed and how we actually analyse the data don't necessarily map very well together. So we chose to use daily values for each variable, and we used postcode to determine the air quality values and the weather. So we took the location of the participant in, mapped that to postcode, and we used the postcode as the. And there were various reasons we did that, partly to do with privacy in terms of when we were processing the data, but also it seemed a reasonable unit of analysis, and it's used by other researchers as well. And really, you would consider something like this, I think, a case crossover design, because what you're doing is you're taking the data from individuals and you're using them as their own controls. So you're saying for this person, given variations in air quality and weather, do their symptoms change? So that's ideally what you want to be doing with this kind of research. I put a question mark there because there is a difficulty with that we will come to shortly. So if we run something like a regression, and we've sort of, we've run a within subjects regression, and we've also looked at this from on a sort of between subjects basis, looking at odds ratios and treating every report as an independent case. Neither of those things I think is the perfect way of dealing with it, actually. I think neither of them are the right way to do it necessarily, but we see similar things, which is basically we see a positive relationship with grass and nettle pollen, which you would expect to see, particularly grass pollen, and we also see a positive relationship with ozone. So this is where ozone levels are higher, we see more severe symptoms, and a hypothesis here could be, we know ozone causes inflammation of the respiratory tract, so that might be a reason for this. I shall return to that. And we also see that the symptoms are negatively related to humidity. And again, you know, it is known to be the case that generally speaking, hay fever is more associated with dry weather. It's easier for pollen to move around and so on. So the issue, though, with this type of analysis, where we're sort of running a regression where we're doing this on a within subjects basis because it's case crossover design, is that we don't find any effect of land use. So whether or not someone's in an urban area or a rural area doesn't appear to make a difference. And we thought this was a bit odd, because if you look at the distribution of reports, and I'll focus, I think, for the sake of timing, and these ones down here. So we've got rural reports on the left and urban reports on the right. And you can see that with rural reports, they're kind of clustered towards the lower end, and they seem to be kind of towards the middle and higher end when you're looking at urban areas. And we know that these two groups are the same. Okay, so demographically, the urban and rural groups are the same in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of how often they take their medication. We know that this is consistent across years. So we see a similar pattern across different years, and we know that we've got mostly different people reporting in different years. So what is going on with this? Well, we think that it's because the case crossover design doesn't work 100% when you're thinking about things like air quality. So if somebody's based in a particular place, you might expect them to experience a variation in weather. So across the British Isles, this is pretty fair to say that wherever you live, you're going to experience a variety of weather. So something like that would work. With air quality, although we know it varies a great deal on a local level, there is also a possibility that actually the air quality you experience consistently if you live in a rural area is going to be quite different to the air quality you can experience consistently or on average in an urban area. And most people tend to report from the same place. So this is sort of a between subjects variable, except we can't really treat it as between subjects variable because, you know, technically it's a within subjects variable, because we know that some people, individuals, will move from place to place. So this gives you an idea of kind of the challenges associated with this. And now we're moving forward to sort of look at this using bootstrap KS test, where we're going to be looking at the differences in distribution of these symptoms, and trying to make sense of it at the level of kind of the contribution average experience of people in these different areas, rather than at the level of the individual, which is not a typical way of doing this research, but we think that it might be one of the ways that we need to look at things in order to draw these relationships out. One final thing that I wanted to sort of mention was that a big part of this kind of research, and it's really important, is engagement with both the public and with policymakers. So we make sure that we kind of are talking to the public about the research that we're doing, we're promoting it quite a lot, and we're also involving them in the design of the app and sort of working out, how we should collect data from people. That's absolutely essential. We've done things like present it at Parliament, and we talked to MPs about it. And of course, everyone's interested in the effects of air quality on health, and we're not in the position where we can tell them a lot about that, but we are in the position where we can work with the Met Office. So Dave mentioned a project earlier with Exeter, and we're also feeding into that in terms of the EMET modelling we've done, and talking with DEFRA about how we locate air quality sensors as well. So that's another thing that we've been doing. And the final thing in terms of public engagement is that we have also recently launched a Brazil breathing app. So we're looking at this in Brazil. Unfortunately, we haven't done as much on this as we'd like, because all Brazilian universities are closed at the moment, which due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which sounds quite depressing. But if you look at our collaborator, Admir Targino's Twitter feeds and social media, you'll see him on the beach a lot. So it's not all bad, I don't think. Okay, so to summarise, what are the take-home messages from the project so far? Well, we can see these relationships at a high level, okay, when we look at the data, and they seem intuitive to us. But standard statistical methods may miss them. So we need to think really carefully about how we interpret the data within our experimental design. It's absolutely the case that the granularity we're using means we might be missing things. So I'm not convinced that the day is the right level of granularity. Okay, there are other studies running looking at sort of personal exposure from the perspective of people carrying sensors, and we need studies at every level, I think, in order to understand what's going on. It's really difficult, even when you have all the data, to draw out causality. So we have seen this association with ozone, okay, but it could just be ozone levels tend to be higher in the summer. And we see actually when we look at odds ratios that NOx is negatively associated with this, and that tends to be higher in the winter. And so it could be actually that what we're just seeing is an artifact of these things happening to be higher or lower, coinciding or not with the pollen seasons. Dave also mentioned male trees in his talk. So when we look at these effects in urban areas, is it down to air quality, or is it just that more male trees are planted there? So that's another thing, another kind of example of a confounding variable, which makes it challenging to understand what's going on. And the final thing is that we've got to consider human behaviour and context, right? That is the most important thing here. We know that things like missing data are a major challenge for understanding symptom data. It's much easier to deal with these things when we're looking at external environmental variables than it is when we think about human behaviour. And so all of these problems are not going to go away, but user-centred design and maintenance of apps for these kinds of studies absolutely essential, and so that is the thing that we are going to be focusing on going forward. And with that, I will answer any questions in the remaining minute that we have left.
Thanks, Caroline. I think you started a bit late, so you were actually on time, but I allowed too much questioning earlier. So okay, so thanks so much for that. I'm just trying to get my applause thing to work. So I think you've addressed maybe Sammy's question in that last slide, actually, because Sammy's asking about confounders and potential confounders that you don't measure. Sammy, I think, is that been covered now, do you think?
To a sufficient extent, yeah. I think you covered it. Thanks.
Okay. Richard has a question about whether you've considered geographical and temporal weighted regression. Richard, I don't know if you want to say that in a clearer way.
Yes, well, it's a particular technique rather than just doing a global regression model, which will miss a lot of variation because of the geography of things. Whether you'd apply GWR, as it's known, to the data, and there's a version now where you can account for time as well to see if there are any temporal influences.
Yeah, so no, we haven't done that yet, and this is absolutely, I think, what we need to be looking at going forward. So we have really only just started with the analysis of the symptom data, and I think that kind of approach sounds like the kind of thing that we should be looking at. We've also got, so Ian Hall is one of our co-investigators, and he's been quite busy recently being on like SAGE and things like that. And he's also got a number of ideas that he's going to feed in related to using GAMS, for example, for looking as an alternative to regression. And so, yeah, so it'd be interesting to chat to you about that, Richard, actually, as well, because this isn't, that's kind of not my area, and I think probably getting your input on that would be really helpful.
Yeah, happy to help. Yeah. Right,
and David Schultz, who's involved in the Cloudy with a Chance of Pain study, has mentioned that, and so it looks like they had a lot of the same issues which he's raised. And I don't know, David, if you're here, if you want to say anything specific, or if it's just more of a comment.
No, I was just discussing, you know, the ideas of, you know, many of the same problems that she faced. You know, people moving around during the course of the day, being far away from sensors, and you know, people, you know, downloading the app and then entering 2 or 3 observations and then leaving. So yeah, happy to make any links if you need any.
Yeah, thanks, David. Actually, I mean, so the Cloudy work's been really useful to us, and it's been reassuring as well to see that you're experiencing the same problems, and also that you've made progress with those. So yes, yeah, it's I believe some of our research software engineers are talking to members of your team actually at the moment about analysis methods.
Right. Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of the session. If anyone has any questions for the 3 speakers, then I'm sure they'll be happy to reply by email. Just contact them and ask them anything specific. Often I think of a good question about half an hour after the meeting, so that's kind of standard. So all that remains is just to thank everyone once more. David's done it with a massive thumb here, so any kind of thing that you can find on the screen to say thank you, or you can even clap. And thanks everyone. And the final Turing Fellow Talks will be next week, so see everyone again then. And thank you.